cannot overlook the importance of a great audio creative ad when it's in these, let's say it's the perfect media plan. If you've got a shit ad, it's still going to do badly, and
It's
vice
true.
versa.
It's true. Absolutely.
Hello, and welcome to PodBiz, the money behind the mic, a podcast about the business of podcasting. I'm Norma Jean Belinkie of NJB Media, a podcast audience development strategist.
And I'm John Kiernan of Podhouse Productions, an all-in-one podcast consultation and editing platform. We're co-hosts on this journey into the world of podcasting as a monetization tool.
Whether you're building branded content, scaling a podcast network, or you're just getting into the podcasting industry, PodBiz breaks down the strategies, tech, and mindset behind podcast success.
We're bringing you insider tips, real talk with industry professionals, strategies that actually work, and talking all about the things that we've seen in the trenches.
So if you're ready to go beyond the downloads and build real impact with your podcast,
then hit subscribe and let's get down to PodBiz.
Welcome to PodBiz. Today we're joined by Andy Maxwell, co-founder of Earmax Media. We'll be speaking all about how brands are holistically buying niche audiences, his journey into podcasting in terms of the UK and Australia markets, and his secret whiskey podcast he made with his grandfather. Let's get down to PodBiz. Andy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
We are so thrilled you're here with us today. Let's get straight into it. Andy, where's the money in podcasting?
The money in podcasting is obviously with the brands, but also with very large media agencies. Yeah, that's obviously where the bulk of it is. That's where it all stems from. And then everyone else, I guess, is kind of competing for that.
Yeah, it's very interesting, right? Because you're on the ad side, which we'll get into in a little bit. I love kind of nerding out on the ad side of things, which we're going to do today. So for everybody who's like, oh, we want another ad episode, here we are. It's definitely one of those things where we're seeing monetization come in several forms, right? Brands are sponsoring shows. There's branded content. Creators are also monetizing their entire audience with that direct payment model. And then on the ad side, brands are starting to invest larger budgets, big budgets in podcasting. And not only is podcasting getting a piece of the pie that's bigger, that piece of the pie is increasing, but the pie is getting bigger. So talk to us a little bit about what you've seen in terms of the overall trend of how brands are investing in podcast advertising.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I guess it differs slightly. So my background's in Australia and the UK.
Yep.
So I've got more exposure to those two markets than to the US. But I guess from when I first got involved in podcasting, and it would pretty much always just be a line item as part of a kind of wider audio buy, which might be broadcast radio plus digital audio. So digital radio, music streaming, plus podcasts, and people really wouldn't think in too much granularity about what they were buying, the sort of shows and the sort of audiences, where now we're working with different brands that actually have podcasts as a big part of their marketing strategy or their creative strategy and content strategy. So I think there is a shift, but it very much depends on the brand. There's still a lot of brands that are guilty of just kind of bundling it in with a wider buy and kind of pre-existing trading deals and things like that. But yes, I think more and more podcasts will get more of the pie. I think with a lot of media agencies, if you're looking at a very big campaign across lots of different channels, audio is probably only going to get 5% of the overall spend if we're lucky. And then obviously podcast is a fraction of that. But then there's obviously other big brands like BetterHelp and NordVPN that actually podcasts and the creator environment is a much bigger part of that pie. So yeah, it depends on the brand, I think, and the audience and kind of how old that brand is as well, maybe.
Yeah, it's very interesting, right? I think in terms of how we're seeing brands spend, like you said, those larger campaigns, they're looking at, overall in terms of all media across, the entire target market that they're looking, whether it's US or UK or Australia, is something where they're like, okay, we're going to invest this much in TV. We're going to invest this much in, like you said, audio, maybe 5%. So you're getting a percentage of a percentage, right? And I think what we're starting to see, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that percentage for podcasting specifically is slowly that like little pie wedge is slowly growing. It's like maybe a slightly bigger, please, sir, may I have some more? Like a little bit more pie, for podcasting specifically in terms of an overall campaign. And we've had a lot of folks come on the show and talk about how some of these big campaigns, 18 months out, right? The media planning is so far in advance that because podcasting is such a young medium, it's one of those things where for creators that maybe are on like mid-range or creators who are larger, it's so important to make sure you have that consistency in terms of your content, in terms of your audience. And so in the past, I think podcasting has maybe been seen as a little bit fickle. And now we're finally like, okay, over the past several years, it's gotten a little bit more and more, and brands are seeing the results of those larger campaigns.
Yeah, and I think it's also down to how the brands actually measure success on those results, right? So I think the brands that are spending as kind of part of audio and wider digital audio buys are thinking still about, okay, how much reach can we get? Yeah. How cheap can we get the CPM? And I think that is not the thinking in the podcast medium. I think we spoke before about not all the focus being on downloads. What we do is actually put the focus on tangible conversions. And I think, the two examples I gave earlier with NordVPN and BetterHelp, they're very performance-driven brands that are going to advertise based on return on ad spend and conversions rather than just, here's 1 million impressions. We don't know where they went, but you got loads of reach and it was really, really cheap. So they're the differences. And I think the more the brands are focused on conversions and, things like brand affinity and brand uplift and aligning with really niche specific audiences with clear messaging, that's what is beautiful about the podcast medium. And that I don't think you can find in any other channel really. Maybe, YouTube content creators, if they've got a niche, I think podcasts and YouTube obviously is kind of the same thing now. But yeah, I think that's where podcasts and podcasters have such an advantage. If you can double down on that audience and that niche, the reach figure doesn't matter as much. It's the community that you build, and you can charge a premium for that community.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing a lot of shows do that. And, I love what you said about BetterHelp and NordVPN. BetterHelp has really been a pioneer in terms of investing in podcast advertising. So it's something where, a brand is saying, hey, we're getting so much more ROI, return on investment, for this spend, specifically in this medium in podcasting. So how can we continue to invest in the medium? How can we continue to support creators? And a lot of creators say, when you're listening to a host read from something like BetterHelp, they're saying, hey, we know it's really hard. Therapy is really helpful. And also like this supports the show. There is more of that transactional relationship with audiences, and audiences are more receptive to brands that support the creators and the work that they love. Absolutely.
Especially if it's authentic, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're in the right environment, the audience is going to know if you're bullshitting. They're going to know if you're endorsing a product just because you're being paid for it. And it's maybe like, towards the end of the show. I mean, that's not really valuable for the brand or the audience. Typically, you find that on those larger shows, if any, with huge reach that are usually represented by a big network. And it's part of a kind of larger ecosystem where sometimes they take the brand and there's higher turnover. So I think actually where we find the most value and the highest conversions as well are those more niche shows where potentially you're the only person branding, you're the only brand sponsoring that episode, or maybe you're one of two max, and you're at different points in the episode where actually the host has tried the product or service, they genuinely believe it, and there's a link in the description or a clear call to action, and they're what we find to have the biggest conversions.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've heard this before from both indie creators that, just completely on their own are breaking six figures. And we've also heard it from ad folks like yourself that, the riches are in the niches, riches in the niches. But it is something where I think being a bigger fish in a smaller pond means that you have more impact with that specific niche audience. And so we are seeing, this is across digital media, right? We're also seeing it in terms of influencers, right? And the rise of the micro influencer or niche influencer on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube and those kind of platforms. So even in social, we're seeing that kind of impact because within digital, everything is so segmented. And, the algorithm is just spoon feeding content to people that it really is something that we're seeing in algorithmically based content as well as podcasting. And we've talked about this before on the show, but podcasting is one of the few mediums outside of YouTube that isn't really algorithmically serving the audience, right? You're only following and listening to the shows that you choose. And so there is also that value for advertisers of somebody who's listening to the show isn't in a doom scroll, right? They're listening because they love the show. They found it, they were recommended it. And, they're part of the community of that show. So I think that that's also particular value. I want to pivot next. You talked about brand uplift. And for a lot of people out there in the branded space and, in the ad space, how is that measured in terms of, repeat campaigns and in terms of justifying that spend with brands?
I mean, there's lots of different ways that brands are measuring and how podcasts fit in there. So there's more and more MMM. So they will work with any kind of MMM company and they'll basically track all of the activity they're doing across multiple different channels. But it's really difficult for podcasts to really even make it onto that because you need a significant amount of reach. So what we do is we work with tracking partners, and you can place pixels on the website. You place pixel on, literally line by line per podcaster, where we can track website visits, leads, purchases, return on ad spend. For brands that aren't comfortable with pixels, there's obviously, unique landing pages and discount codes, which brands have been using for ages. And you'll always hear that, like just to keep using them as an example, like BetterHelp and NordVPN. It's obvious that that's how they do their tracking. But there are also, companies that do brand uplift studies. And that might be part of a wider campaign. But if the podcast campaign is big enough, then it is possible to include it into those. So there are a lot of different ways. It's obviously still not perfect within podcasting because of how fragmented the industry is, but it's better than it's ever been. It's the conversion and those metrics that we use with our clients that keep them coming back and actually spending more, is saying, look, this is actually working. They can see it in the back end, but now we're actually able to track exactly where those conversions are coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. And for everybody out there who's like, what's that algorithm? And MMM is marketing mix modeling. So it's a program that'll help you track that. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. And obviously brands are seeing ROI, but a lot of the time when we're talking about overall brand uplift, because podcasting is still new, right? A lot of agencies like yourself, some of the bigger players are already had proved the concept. But I do think because podcasting is still such a young industry, right? We're still such a young medium, that there is that justification piece that we always have to prove in a way. And
it can be frustrating, right? Because brands will sign off on like an influencer, like you said, for a
TV.
TikTok reel or TV and spend loads of money. But to try and convince them to buy into podcasting just because the CPMs are a bit higher, they're like, oh, I'm not sure about that. And it comes back to educating them on the importance of like an impression in the podcast environment is so much more valuable than an impression in a broadcast radio environment. And to your point earlier, these podcast listeners are actively seeking out this content. Like they've gone out of their way to go on their app or do some research or take a recommendation from a friend to then go and spend up to an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours sometimes listening to a podcast. And when you're listening to a podcast, like, everyone listening to this will know it's kind of like reading a book where you have to concentrate. Otherwise you need to go back 3 pages and kind of go again. So in that kind of environment where it's what we call active attention, opposed to radio, which is passive attention. I mean, I don't know anyone that just kind of sits there staring at a wall listening to the radio. It's usually on in the background. Whilst you're driving your car, when the kids are screaming, whilst you're doing some work, and it's just background noise. And yes, you hear the ads, but you don't really engage with them. And that kind of is why in podcasting, the people buying the media need to be educated on that because not everyone doing the media buying is a podcast listener. And a lot of the time,
thing. Yeah.
So our clients usually the ones that we get over the line quickly is usually like a marketing director that also listens to multiple podcasts. And then it's just like, it's easy because they have that firsthand experience.
Yeah.
They know exactly what we're talking about when we speak about an authentic host read or a branded ad creative. So those 30-second ads you hear, they need to be made for the podcast environment as well. You can't just take a shouty product discount focused radio ad and plonk it in the podcast space because it completely interrupts the flow. Whereas actually, if you create a 30-second ad knowing that it's going to be on let's say a business podcast looking at C-suite executives, it has to be a certain kind of ad creative for that to work. And if you can get it in the right place with the right message, more often than not, you're given 3 or 4 seconds to be considered, and then they'll listen to the end of the episode. So yeah, I think that the education piece is super important.
PodBiz is brought to you by Lean and Loaf, our video podcast partner. Because running a podcast is so much work outside of just recording a podcast.
Lean and Loaf handles our entire post-production pipeline, getting everything platform ready. That way we're not chasing files or managing editing timelines every week.
We really recommend Lean and Loaf. It's been phenomenal. We're a 2-man team. And so for us, it's been fantastic to have the additional support to focus on the content of the show and the incredible guests we've had on.
And really get down to answering the question that you want to know the answer to. Where is the money in podcasting?
Lean and Loaf is trusted by some of the biggest names in the podcasting industry. So we're in really good company with folks like iHeart, HBO, and Netflix.
If you want to take a load off and take your podcast to the next level, head on over to leanandloaf.com.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. People who listen to podcasts love podcasts, right? And so it's about finding those buyers. It's true. It's about finding those buyers that are super fans as well. And it's very interesting, right? I think in terms of the media landscape, how, we all still are consumers. There's that aspect as well. But I do think that educational component is something that's come up several times, and just identifying the education gaps in terms of buying is huge. So are there any other gaps that you've seen in terms of, just what brands and just some of those teams don't necessarily know in terms of the value of podcasting and that ROI?
Yeah, I think number one is obviously the medium, and kind of going back to some of the kind of marketing science around attention and active attention, engagement as well. Mm-hmm. Most people, I think the average consumption of a podcast is around 80%. So people are listening, really highly engaged, and listening to most of the content. So I think that's kind of number one for any podcaster speaking to a media agency or a buyer, is to say, look, yes, it's more expensive, but you've got to pull your head away from just 100,000 impressions equals $7 CPM.
Yeah.
Like, it has to be, this is what you're buying. This is the CPM because of the audience that you're buying, and being really highly targeted. So I think that's number one. And then probably the second bit of education is the difference between an impression, a download, a unique listener, the ad slots. So there's a very big difference between an ad being served first in the mid-roll to fourth in the post-roll, which most people know, that's actually never going to get listened to.
Yeah,
even though the ad is being counted. Exactly. And even third in the pre-roll or fourth in the pre-roll. And I know in the US, there's some podcasts will have like 6 ads.
Yeah, it's like 2 to 3 minutes, I think, sometimes for some shows that just really pack it in. And it's interesting, right? And sometimes ads are served in the exact, I want to say, skippable increments. So
exactly. And as a listener, most podcast ads, if they're a pre-recorded ad, is 30 seconds. So all you have to do is double tap and you've missed it.
Yeah.
So the brand thinks that that's been heard, but because we're in an environment that you can skip the ad, in a lot of cases, it won't have been. So I think, again, this is where, as a buyer, you have to be really conscious of the nuances that can make a huge difference in actually driving those conversions. So if you want to do it properly, pushing for pre and mid-roll ad slots, or if it's a post-roll, making sure that it's not right at the end after the podcast is finished, bringing that further down, ensuring that you're not going to be third or fourth in an ad slot, pushing for that first or second. kind of slot in whichever it is.
Yeah, I guess my next question is, what are the politics and jockeying for position, right? on on some of those placements.
It's a good question, and it's something that can be difficult to navigate because it's a bit of a, I guess, like a black hole for some of the networks.
Oh yeah,
where they're probably not fully transparent with the people buying it. Some of them. And obviously, everyone is in this to make money for the podcaster and for their own business. So yes, we want to put more ads in there if possible, but also not to the detriment of the listener and not to the detriment of just filling a podcast with ads that might not ever be heard, but the brand isn't really aware of that. So in terms of the politics, for me, I would always pay a higher CPM to get further along in the pre and the mid roll, but it really just depends on demand, I guess. So the bigger podcast shows and the bigger networks will be less flexible. Sometimes they'll be like, look, it's pre, mid, and post. You can't pick first and ad break, take it or leave it, because they have enough demand.
Yeah.
But then there'll be some shows where there's a lot more negotiation. You can be really flexible. It can be first in the pre and mid roll and you pay a bit more. And then there's some networks that actually package up their podcast with this in mind, who I assume are probably more transparent with the buyer in terms of, you might have like a primary sponsorship and a secondary sponsorship. And that primary sponsorship, you'll pay more for, an ad in the pre-roll, first in the mid-roll, and then the post-roll. But then there's kind of a discounted price for second in the mid-roll and second in the post-roll.
Yeah, absolutely.
To me, I would always be going for the primary, but I guess there's an argument for paying less for those secondary slots as well.
Yeah, maybe something where it's supplemental to other ad placements they have in other podcasts. And I do think it makes sense, to price differently for first and best dressed. And some of the larger networks, like you said, they don't have to be that forthcoming or be that detailed. It may also just be like a bandwidth detail thing, but I do think it's something where, from your standpoint with Earmax, you guys are really a steward of your brand's dollars, right? So you want to go in and you want to get the best deal for your brands.
And ultimately, because we base success on conversions and like tangible business outcomes, it's not good enough for us to just say, we secured you 2 million impressions at a really cheap CPM, kind of like pat on the back, but what happened to them? So if we want to actually drive conversions, then we know the best chance of that happening is to be in those premium ad slots on podcasts that, we're making decisions based on the content, based on what they talk about, based on the host, all of these different factors, the demographics, where we'll look at Spotify demographics to see the exact age brackets and any other information. And we'll pull in everything from lots of different suppliers rather than just, one or two, or rather than just buying programmatically. We really consider every podcast, I guess, on the planet, in the entire ecosystem, before we then recommend something to the brand and say, look, we can be pretty certain this is your best bang for buck.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think it's something where, when you're an advertiser, making sure that you work with the right partner and you're focused on, whatever those needs are, right? Maybe you have a larger campaign, you want access to shows that are really hard to get into. Maybe you want more of an agency that's going to be like a partner and hands-on. I do think it's something where that educational component is so important because, we've had Adam McNeil on from Adopter Media, and he said previously, he's like, when a brand doesn't have a good experience with podcasting, they don't think, hey, it wasn't maybe the most optimized campaign. They think podcasting doesn't work.
Exactly.
And so we're all kind of like advocating for the industry, one campaign at a time.
I think that's it. That's a great point. A brand has a bad experience, usually because of the issues that I've just said, right? They're like, well, we paid this money, got all these impressions, but what's happened? Oh, podcasting must not work because we see the same impressions and what that can do on Meta or on search or with these other kind of digital first channels that tracking is much easier. So I think, again, I agree with Adam completely. Like it's frustrating when other agencies or brands don't do it properly and just blame the channel, when actually it's just, you could have used that same amount of budget and had completely different results with a slightly different strategy.
Well, I want to talk next about Earmax. You co-founded Earmax a couple of years ago, and you were living in Australia at the time, but you have a little bit more of a media background. So tell us about how you got into podcasting in general. You're originally from the UK, and then you moved to Australia.
Yes. So I first worked for a WPP brand agency, which is really where I started my career, working on big brands. That was for 3 to 4 years. And then I worked for a broadcast PR company / marketing consultancy.
Yep.
And just before COVID, the owners had set up a branded podcast consultancy. And so I ended up being moved into that part of the business and helped run that business. And basically we would work with brands, not always producing the podcast, but coming up with the kind of overarching content marketing strategy, I guess, for that podcast. So this was around, I guess, 5 years ago now when I first really got into the podcast space. And we would be looking at, the same way that we might help a podcaster grow their audience. Well, who are the guests that you're having on? How can we grow it organically? How are we sharing it on socials? What are the assets that we're creating? And, advocating for video podcasts as far as 5 years ago, which we did for, Visa, Rosetta Stone, the language learning company, some financial services brands.
Yeah.
And then sometimes we just did the strategy as well. But part of that would be the paid media strategy, which when you're advertising or promoting a podcast, the first place to start is obviously on other podcasts, because we know that at least 100% of the people are reaching our podcast listeners already. And this is a mistake
exactly. That is what I tell my clients all the time in terms of audience stuff. It's like, well, they're already podcast listeners.
Exactly. And I see podcast promotion on Instagram, like a static image for a podcast. I mean, the amount of wastage in an ad like that is crazy, because people on Instagram and TikTok, yes, there are podcast listeners on there. But if they're not, you've not only got to convince them to listen to the podcast, you've got to convince them to become a podcast listener as well. So
absolutely. I mean, that's 100% true. We had Colin Anderson come on, who, launched Office Ladies and has done some really great work. And I think he gave the stat, and I'll have to go back to the episode, but I believe it was that in the first week, there was like 200,000 new people to listen to podcasts because of that show. And it's one of those things where the conversion of people who are just general, media consumers into podcast consumers is huge. And so meeting people where they're at is so important. And for everybody out there who's like, oh, these branded podcasts, like there's so much work that goes into it, right? And there's so many people who are evaluating audience, looking at partnerships, looking at cross promo, looking at, how the brand's values can be conveyed. It's something where, brands, especially even a few years ago, a lot of brands were investing almost speculatively into podcasting to say, okay, what stories can we tell that are going to relay our brand values that maybe won't cost as much as other traditional media.
Yeah. Although it can be, and
it can.
The thing. I mean,
it can be super costly to make a branded podcast. Yeah.
And it's, it's a lot of time, a lot of resource. And it's actually kind of why I stepped away from branded podcasts specifically, because I believe now that, if you really want to do a branded podcast series, and they can be super successful, you have to really commit long term. Like I don't think doing a one-off 6-episode series for me doesn't make sense.
No.
Because you have to spend probably 3 times as much promoting that branded podcast series.
And if it were continual, right? Or evergreen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So just going back to that, that's where I kind of got into the media buying side of things, where we would look at promoting a branded podcast series. And then back then, it was really just kind of Acast and Spotify that I would be speaking to at the time, who, Acast are the biggest player in the UK, and Spotify, obviously everyone knows.
Global.
So, exactly.
2 Swedish companies taking over the world.
There you go, of podcasting.
Yeah.
But basically what I found was we were just getting kind of the same plans. And obviously it's evolved a lot compared to kind of 5 years ago.
Of course.
But it was the same kind of plans from the same people. I was very time poor at the time, so I wasn't really doing much due diligence. And I just had the thought that, there must be other podcasts out there outside of these big networks. And why don't we start, briefing it out to some independents and some others? And what can we do with maybe optimizing where these 30-second ads are going? And the more and more I looked into it, it just kind of became this Pandora's box. And fast forward 3 years from when I first really started thinking about it properly. And I'm here now. So a lot has happened between now and then, and the business compared to when we started has just, it's completely different. And it's changed a lot. So it's been an exciting journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And what have you noticed in the difference between the UK market and Australian market? Obviously, the UK is bigger, but you did move to Australia a couple of years ago. You're back in the UK now, but it's rare to have experience on two continents that are both English speaking. That obviously the UK market is bigger than Australia, but US is also the biggest. So, what have you noticed in terms of the difference between those two markets?
I mean, Australia is a great market because per capita, it's actually up there with the US in terms of listenership. So per capita, Australia has more listeners than the UK. It's just there's only 27 million people in Australia. So you kind of capped out, like you can only get so far. So the difference is budget, I guess, and possibly the amount of brands that are spending in podcasts specifically, I would say is more in the UK. But the podcast market in Australia is amazing. Like there's so much great content out there. The networks are brilliant out there. The kind of independent publishers and independent podcasters as well. They're really advanced in terms of the content that they put out there. I think it's just the actual buyers maybe have some catching up to do in terms of the priorities that they have. And, we've got clients in both Australia and the UK, and some of our UK clients spend in Australia as well.
Of course.
And I think it's just noticing the difference in spend between the UK and Australia is kind of what prompted the move back here. And we've got a new business partner now, Sean Wilson, who's left Audio Boom to join us. So I think there's just tons of opportunity here. And I think probably the other thing I've noticed is with the UK, there's probably an earlier adoption of selling podcasts as more of a kind of integrated campaign. Like we've done that work in Australia where you use the podcast as the base and then expand into, using the video podcast onto YouTube and then socials and then boosting those assets as well. And I'd say that probably the UK has started selling that proposition a bit quicker than Australia. And I'd say they're probably the main differences, but both are really, I'd say, quite advanced and the biggest behind the US.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've definitely seen that trend, right? With some of the larger players in podcasting, right? Saying, okay, we're going to help our creators sell their social. We're going to help them sell their events. We're going to help them package, overall sponsorship. So I do think it's something where as we're seeing podcasting enter the mainstream media even more, there's this kind of like blurred line, right? Of, well, now there's video and clips on social, and how can we sell into that? And it's all a bit nebulous, but it's taking shape. Yes.
It is, yeah. And there's a big shift at the moment in like the wider marketing world going towards like the creator economy and the value of brands aligning with not just influencers. I think there is a difference between an influencer and a creator. A creator is actually producing long form content that is engaging as opposed to just kind of relying on an Instagram page where they're promoting pictures and kind of one version of themselves. Whereas creators are very much, I think it's a deeper relationship. And ultimately, every single podcast host is a creator. So I think there's this unique opportunity now in podcasting to actually be kind of going back to the branded podcast days. Like it is the base of a wider content marketing strategy for brands that want to take it seriously. You can go into those creator partnerships that span YouTube and TikTok and Instagram, but you can also start with podcasts and create amazing 30-second brand ads that then can be really easily distributed programmatically into digital audio and broadcast radio. So kind of using the podcast channel as the anchor for all of those different touch points.
Yeah, absolutely. I almost think of it as like the hub, and then, everything else is kind of the offshoot, because podcasting is the long form content these days, right? Like it is the flagship, right, of a lot of content strategy. It's very, very cool. Well, Andy, what would you say is one key move or metric or even a mindset that's made the biggest impact on your podcasting career, and also maybe the success of the brands that you work with?
I think it's the focus on kind of knowing what you buy before you buy it, and the focus on driving actual business outcomes, whatever that might be, whether it's return on investment, proving purchases, generating leads that are longer tail. I think our campaigns, we always think about that before we buy anything. And then it's also matching that with top class creative. So our sister agency is Eardrum, and my business partner is Ralph Van Dyke, who is the most awarded audio creative globally. He set up Eardrum over 30 years ago. And you cannot overlook the importance of a great audio creative ad when it's in these, let's say it's the perfect media plan. If you've got a shit ad, it's still going to do badly, and
it's
vice
true.
versa.
It's true. Absolutely. I mean, yes. Thank you.
So I'd say those are the key things. It's really, a focus on conversions and proving tangible business outcomes, highly detailed media planning based on the things I spoke about before, context and the host and the topics, and combine that with really great creative. And then, you will see success. Like we've seen it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Andy, what's something that people don't know about what you do?
Good question. So people might not know that I actually produced my own podcast series with my granddad called Whiskey Legends. He's got a whiskey distillery in Scotland and has been in the industry since his granddad, which was like early 1900s. So we did a kind of 8-part documentary style whiskey series, just the evolution of the whiskey industry through his eyes from when he was working.
So cool.
Yeah, it was cool. And he's such a cool person. I was like, and he's got all these amazing stories. And I was like, Pops, you have to do a podcast with me. We need to get these stories out there.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's also kind of, I guess, what gave me such an appreciation for the productions and the hosting side of things that you obviously do, and creators as well. So yeah, that's one thing people don't know. And then I did have a kind of slight YouTube series when I was traveling in Southeast Asia before I got there to Australia. So I still use that to kind of check the latest consumption and the different metrics you can get available on YouTube now, which obviously helps a lot with what I do on the advertising side of things.
Okay, for everyone out there, what is the name of the whiskey? We need to. Where can I get a bottle, Andy?
So the latest one is the Clydeside. So it's in Glasgow. It's the only distillery in Glasgow, and they opened that in, I think, 2018.
Okay.
But he used to own multiple distilleries back in the 60s, which is in Islay. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Yep.
But it's a little island off the west coast of Scotland. Yes, if you're ever in Glasgow, let me know, and you should definitely go on a tour.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That might be the best answer to this question we've had yet. Fantastic. Well, we've talked a lot about, different brand campaigns that have been successful, but obviously you've had a background both working with brands, your own personal projects, and now on the ad side. What's something that didn't go to plan, and what did you learn from it?
When I first got into podcasting, going back to the branded episode side of things, I think we underestimated that, yes, we've created this amazing content, but without actually putting the time and money, more importantly, into promoting that.
Oh, God.
I think it's just the audience, like I was looking and it was getting 100 downloads an episode. And I was like, what? I thought it was going to be 10,000 downloads an episode. What's happened? So I think that was a huge wake up call. And, that was years ago. So I think now it's even more difficult to break through as a podcaster because every celeb and their dog is creating a podcast. So I think that was a big learning and pretty much what prompted me to get into the advertising side. If you're a brand and you've got $50,000 or pounds or whatever, and you're thinking, oh, we want to have a branded podcast, I would strongly advise, unless you're willing to commit to that podcast long term, as in weekly or bi-weekly for years, you're much better off sponsoring podcasts with a built-in audience already of exactly who you want to reach and hosts that you trust, and just kind of piggyback off their success. And if it works, you can almost turn that into your own branded podcast if the alignment is good enough. So I'd say, yeah, that was a big learning of something that didn't go well is creating the thing, but not having the kind of resource to actually promote it properly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're preaching to the choir on this. For a lot of my clients in terms of audience development, right? I advise that budget for promoting the content should be equal to the budget for creating the content.
At least.
And not everybody wants to hear that. Right?
No, and it's
if you have
difficult.
$50,000 to make a podcast series, drop it to 25 and make sure that you have 25 allocated for promotion, right?
Yeah.
And, it's because of the fact that we've talked about this earlier on the episode, that podcasting isn't an algorithmically based medium. You need to have people recommending your show, whether it's cross promo through other content creators, other podcasts, whether it is social, whether it is branded host read, whether it is branded podcasts, that you also sponsor, like you said. Sometimes you don't even need to reinvent the wheel. You just need to sponsor another show. But
exactly.
it is definitely a conversation that I have had more than once. So it's something where I'm like, great, how much budget do we have? And every audience development peer that we've had here on PodBiz, that, it's always like, well, you can always be creative. And it's like, yes, we can all bootstrap. Yes, we all know how to do that. And also, it's easier with budget.
Yeah, it's just, when there's budget there, it's just more of a definitive thing. As you all know, with doing audience development, and as I did with the Whiskey Legends podcast,
so cool.
Messaging every single whiskey influencer on Instagram and saying, please share this with this exact link. And they're pretty much always happy to do it if they think the content is good.
Yeah.
But it's just the way that, they might miss the link and then people aren't clicking it. And so if you pay for that, they're much more likely to share it. If you get them on the podcast, that's going to go better as well. So, and you know all of this stuff already, so I don't need to.
No. It's always helpful, I think, for whoever's listening to hear, because it's something where when we're talking about that promotional and marketing aspect of podcasting, it's so granular. There's just so many details all the time. And, like we both said, budget helps, right? Of course, you can do something on a shoestring, but a lot of it is also labor. So if you don't know how, or you're trying to do it yourself, it's also how much time do you have to dedicate? And a lot of the teams we work with, they're already a full marketing team for a brand, right? And so when we're talking about promoting content, they don't have somebody on their team who has 20 to 30 hours a week.
Yeah.
To even build those relationships. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So,
which it needs, right? And, we did this so ANZ Bank are one of our clients in Australia. They're one of the big four. And we worked with the institutional team to promote their podcast 5 and 5 with ANZ. And it's literally a daily markets podcast from the kind of, they have a journalist that hosts it and they'll speak to different economists from ANZ. That's obviously very, very niche. And there's a big difference between just kind of spending a little bit of money targeting business audiences through the Spotify audience network and actually going out and finding really specific business focus or markets focused podcasts in Australia and then into APAC as we did. So again, like for anyone listening, it really does need the time and ideally the spend if you really want to grow the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Andy, if you had to start over today, what would you do differently to grow faster or smarter?
I would say that there was a couple of points where we hesitated and considered working with other media agencies. Obviously, that could open up a lot more clients, and we probably spent a little bit too much time debating that. And if I could go back, I would just double down on working direct with brands straight away and being their kind of trusted partner rather than, contemplating be a supplier to a different agency. I would say that would be the main thing.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, right? In terms of the landscape of ad buying.
Yeah.
And some of the agencies, I want to say boutique, but a lot of big numbers are run through them. So it's more hands-on, I would say. But and I do think it's specific to each brand's goals and the reach they want. And, also if they're going through an agency, what the campaigns look like. But there does seem to be a trend with, I don't want to say mid-size or boutique, but agencies who have more of a hands-on approach, who act more like partners in terms of that ad buy.
And I mean, it was difficult because there will be certain brands that are big global brands that we probably just won't be able to work with directly because they have agreements in place that says, this is our media agency, you have to work with them. So that was a consideration because obviously those brands have huge budgets. But I think for us, the focus now is working with brands and especially marketers, brand owners that are agile and really understand the medium and want to do it properly. And I think that's where our focus has kind of been and will be going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Andy, what are you most excited about coming up within the podcasting industry?
I think the main thing I'm kind of waiting for is the introduction of video digital ad insertion. There was a lot of announcements from Spotify and Apple and YouTube as there usually is, but I haven't seen anything actually happen yet. And I'm speaking to these different networks, and I think it's all kind of coming to fruition soon. So I think we're really keen to test that and see how it, opens up more opportunities for podcasters that do have that video aspect, because obviously they'll be able to monetize the entire back catalog now rather than just video episodes having to bake in ads for that one specific episode. So I think that will be really interesting to see. And then just how the space continues to evolve and kind of merge with the creator space, I think is something that's going to happen more and more.
Yeah, absolutely. And just hearing your answer on that, it almost makes me wonder what video baked in is going to do in the creator space.
I think it's interesting because it depends on the podcast. Like the rest is history. Obviously, episode 5 is just as relevant as episode 500. But if it's same with those kind of interview style podcasts that it's just interviewing a person about their life story, that's going to be relevant.
It's evergreen.
Exactly. It's evergreen. Whereas some shows that are, let's say, a sports show
news
that is talking
politics.
About what's happened that week, politics, right? They probably baked in ads still make sense because the bulk of the episodes are going to be there. So if I was them, I'd probably stick with that strategy. But for those big shows that have the evergreen content, it's going to unlock a lot of new budget for them, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the intersection of how some of those video ads may cross over into clip strategy we're seeing on other platforms.
Well, that, and also people I don't think have really considered what the kind of pre-recorded 30-second video ads will be like. So it's something that we're exploring, is actually because our audio ads are so good, we can kind of supplement that with a kind of light touch video rather than just being served a holding image of a company logo. Whilst
you mean people don't want to stare at a static image of a company logo? That doesn't perform well.
Exactly. So I think that will open up new opportunities, both in terms of reach and tracking and also creatively as well. I think there'll be more opportunities because you don't want to just be whacking a TV ad in there just in case someone is not listening, because it won't make sense, right? So we need to have that kind of hybrid between an audio and a video ad, I guess.
Yeah, what are they calling it now? Audio optimized video.
Okay, that's a new one for me. I'll write that down.
Well, Andy Maxwell, co-founder of Earmax Media, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Norma.